Okay, so moving on to our next speaker this evening, it's a real honour to present to you Sir Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria. Peter brings with him this evening a unique perspective to share with you, having lived and worked in Syria as a member of the Foreign Office. Tonight, Peter will be discussing the difficulties one faces whilst trying to get a non-mainstream narrative heard in the mainstream media. So please join me in welcoming Sir Peter Ford.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Well, this is a trial of the media, and the charge, as far as I'm concerned, is use of WMD, weapons of mass deception. Among these weapons of mass deception is exclusion, trying to keep people like me, who try to offer a balanced point of view, out. And I am strongly of the opinion that there is a fatwa against me gone out in Channel 4 in particular, and the BBC World Service. Proprietors Boris Johnson and the British Foreign Office are the paymasters, of course, of the World Service. It's noticeable that I am fortunate at times of crisis in Syria to get invited by very many of the mainstream media. And I'll come in a moment to the mechanics of that, why I get a bit of a look in. But it's noticeable that Channel 4 and the BBC World Service keep me at arm's length because, of course, they have the agenda of which you've just seen some very eloquent examples. So exclusion is one weapon. Another is omission, the things that the mainstream media don't tell you about Syria. One of these, for example, is the impact of sanctions. Now, you could be forgiven for not being aware that Syria is subject to very severe sanctions on the part of the EU and most of the Western world. But these sanctions are extremely damaging to the Syrian economy and are in large part responsible for the exodus of hundreds of thousands of jobless Syrians. So the sanctions are coming back to bite us. And we've all seen the impact of those images of Syrian migrants. It partly explains why we had the result that we did in the Brexit referendum. And of course, that led to the events of this week at home as well. So what happens in Syria is extremely important to us, but our government appears to give no thought to the far-reaching consequences of actions like sanctions. And why? Because the media aren't reporting it, aren't doing any investigation on the impact of sanctions. Parliament also, it should be on the charge sheet here, because they are failing, even the official opposition is failing to ask questions about sanctions. Why? Because of the media. Because Assad is seen as toxic, and anyone who dares to ask a question that might be remotely helpful to the Syrian government would be taxed with being a defender of the butcher Assad, and therefore they're afraid to raise these questions at all. And so they continue to be, well, ignored, brushed under the carpet. Other omissions include any analysis or real coverage of the so-called rebels. We've seen some images tonight. We have an idea. But during the Aleppo crisis, broadly, the rebels were airbrushed out of the picture. you only seemed to see ordinary civilians, doctors, and victims. You didn't actually see the jihadis who were lobbing mortars into the bigger part of Aleppo, government-controlled part of Aleppo. You didn't see that, just airbrushed out of the picture. And then you don't see anything of the enormous humanitarian efforts being made by one party. You might imagine that some big NGO, or perhaps the EU, or perhaps America, or perhaps Britain's DFID was the biggest party helping refugees. Well, no, it's the government of Syria. The number of internally displaced is far greater than the number of refugees outside Syria. And these are being helped on a massive scale by the government of Syria, even though it barely has the money to buy ammunition for its own soldiers, and yet it gives succor to millions of the internally displaced. Is this covered by the media? Not a word of credit for that, because it doesn't fit the narrative. But I am going to enter a plea of mitigation, because in times of crisis, I have been fortunate to get an opportunity to present, or try to present, a balanced case, but only in moments of crisis. And this is why it's important to understand the dynamics of the mainstream media. 24-hour, round-the-clock news coverage is an awful lot of time to fill. And the networks are desperate to find experts, talking heads. And when Syria is top of the news, they're desperate to get anyone with any remote expertise to talk about it. And so they come to me. And then one thing leads to another. Once one of the networks has you on, and they're all watching each other like hawks, your phone doesn't stop ringing. I've experienced this twice, during the Aleppo crisis and more recently during the Idlib chemical weapons incident. My phone was ringing off the hook. I was doing 5, 6, 7 interviews a day. Admittedly, I'm a media tart. You have to be. If you want to get your case across, you don't have to pass up any opportunity. I think I reached the bottom of the barrel when I gave an interview to, nobody here from Hereford, I hope, Radio Hereford. But you really have to make yourself available. And very often they stand you up. The night before, Good Morning Britain, for example, call you up. Can you be down in London tomorrow at 7 o'clock? And then an hour later, they stand you down. But you have to be prepared. You have to go to almost any length to have the chance to put your case across. And then bear in mind that the networks are competing not only with each other, but internally. The BBC is a vast empire, and television, BBC television, is competing with BBC radio. The best feedback I ever got for an interview I gave was from John Humphrey's morning radio program Today. They were very pleased with that. They said, because it set the day's news agenda. BBC television picked up the story, BBC website picked up the story of what I'd said attacking the government, and that set the day's agenda. And this is the holy grail for journalists in news. So you can sometimes ride, or you can surf this wave if you're lucky, and if you play the media at their own game, like sound bites. I think now in terms of sound bites, because I know this helps to get me invited back. I think my proudest moment was when I managed on one of the main channels to call Boris Johnson a scary clown. And this was very topical because it was in the week. Do you remember several months ago when scary clowns were the topic of the week? And we all learned what the word coulrophobia meant, fear of clowns. And I said, well, there's Boris Johnson popping up at the dispatch box like a scary clown. And this was rewarded with a Daily Express headline. Daily Express. This is the peak of achievement for an advocate of balanced coverage. So you have to play the media, you have to work the media. They're working you. They say, you know, we can use you tomorrow. Oh, thanks a lot. You're going to use me. Right, I'm going to use you to get a balanced message across. And bless their heart, sometimes they do give you a genuine opportunity. The BBC breakfast show, I've been on 3 times, and although they appear to question aggressively, I think if you're prepared, then it can work to your advantage. But it is important to be prepared and have your sound bites ready. I come to one more omission, however. Now I've reminded myself an important omission that the media are ignoring, and that is the presence of British troops in Syria. Now, you could be forgiven for not being aware that there are British troops in Syria. But there are. They're in a place called Al-Tanf, which is on the border with Jordan, and they're there allegedly in a training function alongside American. They are special forces alongside American special forces, ostensibly training Syrian Islamist fighters to fight other Islamist fighters, if you believe that. But not a word of this in the British media. I haven't seen it anyway. And again, Parliament is the opposition of falling down on the job because the troops are there without any mandate from Parliament, let alone the agreement, of course, of the Syrian government or any UN mandate. No, they're just there because we can. And again, it comes down to the media. Because the media are ignoring it, there's no scrutiny, the government can get away in our name with anything they like on Syria. I think I've probably exhausted your patience, and there is a lot more interesting pictures to see. So I will shut up at this point, but I'm very ready to say a bit more in the question and answer session which will follow.